This video will give an overview of how the Bitcoin Lightning Network works under the hood. Although still quite volatile, Bitcoin is generally succeeding as a store of value, but it's still not a currency people actually use in their daily lives. This is partly because it can cost over $10 to send a transaction and take hours to confirm. The Lightning Network is a second layer built on top of Bitcoin that promises to fix these problems, making transactions instant, inexpensive, and more private. Here's a demo sending 5 cents with Lightning. I scan a code to initiate the transfer, and seconds later, the transfer is complete and only cost me 2 sats or 0.06 cents. When payments are this cheap and fast, it opens up possibilities like sending Bitcoin inside games. This is a racing tournament put on by Zebedee, the sponsor for this video, where players get real Bitcoins for running over coins and winning. Zebedee has plugins that make it easy to integrate Bitcoin into games. To be clear, these aren't in-game points, but real Bitcoins that players can easily spend outside of the game. If you're a gamer, you can use Zebedee's wallet to put a QR code on your Twitch stream to accept tips. And if you're a fan, you can get into the action during tournaments by purchasing power-ups, breaking the fourth wall. Check out the description for more info. One other idea enabled by Lightning micropayments, paying per minute for a podcast. Don't like it after 5 minutes? You only paid half a penny. And to clarify, all these transfers involved real Bitcoin, not a Lightning coin. The Lightning Network provides a way to send regular Bitcoin using clever scripts and protocols. Let's start off with an analogy of opening a tab at a bar. You give your credit card to the bartender and start ordering drinks. The bartender keeps a tab but doesn't charge a credit card until the end of the night. The reason for this is that running the credit card takes time from the bartender and costs the bar extra transaction fees every time a credit card is run. So it's cheaper and easier to just keep track of your balance until the end and isn't risky because the bartender could always just charge a credit card if you run off. The Lightning Network works similarly. Instead of giving Bob a credit card, Alice deposits money into an address called a payment channel. Alice sends Bob some money by creating a transaction that spends money from that payment channel holding address and giving it to Bob. Just like the bartender could have charged the credit card after the first drink order, Bob could broadcast the transaction to the Bitcoin network, but chooses not to because he knows Alice is going to want more than one drink and doesn't want to spend the time or money to get that transaction confirmed on the main blockchain. Each time Alice orders another drink, she creates another transaction that replaces the previous. Alice and Bob are keeping track of the balance internally without updating the global Bitcoin ledger. In this way, Alice and Bob can exchange thousands of transactions without ever touching the Bitcoin blockchain and paying that high fee. But magically, they aren't risking anything. At any point, Bob could broadcast the latest transaction to close out the tab and secure his money on the Bitcoin blockchain. This is the fundamental magic of the Lightning Network, taking transactions onto a second layer, where transacting is as cheap and fast as sending an email, but it's still backed by the security of Bitcoin because transactions could at any point be broadcast. When Alice and Bob want to close the tab or payment channel, they create a transaction that pays the final balances out to Alice and Bob and broadcast that to the Bitcoin network. Lightning also enhances privacy because the blockchain will only ever have a record of the funding and closing transactions, not any of the transactions in between. Going beyond just two people, suppose Alice wants to make a purchase from Carol's art store but doesn't already have a channel with Carol. The Lightning protocol wouldn't be as useful if Alice had to set up a payment channel with every new person she wanted to send money to, because setting up channels requires an expensive transaction on the Bitcoin network. Luckily, if Bob already has a channel with Carol, Alice can send money through Bob's channel, and amazingly, without having to trust Bob. Alice creates a contract using the Bitcoin scripting language that only pays Bob if he pays Carol. This way, Alice doesn't have to worry about Bob running off with her money. Bob must pay Carol to unlock the amount sent to him. And this continues to work even if there are many other people in the chain. A chain of contracts is set up that guarantees money gets all the way through or not at all. Let's dive into how this works at a technical level now. Some familiarity with Bitcoin transactions is probably necessary to understand this, so if you need a refresher, check out my video, How Bitcoin Works Under the Hood. At a technical level, the payment channel is a two-person multi-signature address, which just means that it takes 2 signatures to spend money out of it. Kind of like a joint bank account that requires 2 signatures for withdrawals. To open the payment channel, Alice sends money into this address by broadcasting a funding transaction. This is somewhat equivalent to Alice handing over her credit card to Bob at the bar. By depositing money somewhere that requires both Alice and Bob's cooperation to withdraw from, neither one can run away without agreeing about who owns what. After Alice broadcasts the funding transaction and after it gets confirmed on the blockchain, they both internally start keeping track of a balance. Initially, Alice will have 100,000 sats and Bob 0. To buy a drink from Bob for 10,000 sats, Alice will create what's called a commitment transaction that sources the funding transaction as the input, pays her 90K and Bob 10K. She and Bob both sign this transaction and keep a copy, but critically they don't broadcast it. When Alice wants a second drink, she creates another transaction replacing the first, this time sending her 80K and Bob 20K, effectively moving another 10K from her balance to Bob's. If Bob ever makes a mistake on a drink, the same process happens with the creation of a new transaction, except the numbers adjust in Alice's favor. During all these exchanges, none of these transactions ever touch the real blockchain, but amazingly are still backed by the blockchain. Bob or Alice could broadcast the latest transaction at any time to cash out of the payment channel, which would send each of them their share of the channel, but they don't, because they expect to have more transactions, and broadcasting to the real blockchain would likely cost more than a drink. Now there are a few holes we have to plug in this scheme. Going back to the funding transaction, what if Bob disappears immediately after Alice commits money to the channel? Now Alice's funds are trapped in a multi-signature address that requires both her and Bob's signatures to send money back out of it, but Bob is gone. To address this problem, Alice gets Bob to sign a transaction sending all the money back to Alice before she broadcasts the initial funding transaction. That way, if Bob disappears after she funds the channel, she can simply broadcast the pre-signed refund transaction to get her money back out. While that prevents Alice from getting her money stuck, there's another security gap involving prior states. Even though I've colored the prior transactions gray, they're still valid, fully signed transactions. And although the latest transaction might direct 80K to Alice, there's a previous one giving her 90K. What's to stop her from broadcasting that one, even after Bob gave her a drink? This is where 90% of the complexity behind the Lightning Network comes in. So far, Alice and Bob have been signing transactions, which you could think about as each signing checks from a joint bank account to each other, but never cashing out. Each time they sign a new set of checks, they would ideally rip up the previous ones. But there's just no good way to rip up or invalidate older signed Bitcoin transactions. Even if they both claim to have deleted the older transactions, there's no guarantee that one of them didn't keep a copy and might someday later broadcast it. To get around this, the Lightning Protocol doesn't require Alice or Bob to promise to delete older transactions, but rather includes a clever way to punish either one of them if they do broadcast an older transaction. Instead of just paying Alice her share directly, the transaction includes a path that Bob can use to take Alice's share. You can see it says, if revocation secret, pay to Bob. This means if Bob has this thing called a revocation secret and Alice publishes this transaction, he'll be able to take her share. Now remember, Bob should only be able to claim this for old transactions, so Alice only reveals this secret as she's creating a new transaction and revoking the previous one. Now, if she broadcasts the prior transaction, Bob can punish her because he has the revocation secret. Let's walk through exactly how Bob claims that 90K because there are a few more complications lurking. Assume Alice is trying to cheat by cashing out an older state shown here and has broadcast this transaction to the blockchain, even though her current balance in the latest transaction is lower. Bob sees this hit the blockchain, realizes she's trying to cheat, and then acts to claim the 90K for himself. He does this by creating another transaction that cites this one as the input, sets the output to another address he controls, and provides the secret and a signature to unlock it. In Bitcoin, money is stored in these outputs until someone else posts another transaction spinning it, like this one by Bob. But if Bob isn't paying attention, Alice could swipe that output for herself if she posts a transaction spinning it before Bob. And once she does that, the output is consumed and Bob can no longer punish Alice. So we see this if revocation secret line alone isn't enough. Bob must also race Alice to create another transaction spinning that output. To prevent that, we add one more condition to the logic, a timer that prevents Alice from using the output for 24 hours. This way, if Alice posts this transaction after it's revoked, Bob has 24 hours to spend the output. This brings us to one of the negatives of Lightning. Bob needs to keep a close watch on the blockchain for revoked transactions, but luckily he can enlist the help of third-party watchtowers to help with this. Now keep in mind this only applies to older revoked transactions. For the most recent transaction, the revocation secret will not have been revealed. So if Bob disappears, Alice can still broadcast the latest transaction to get her money out of the payment channel without worrying that Bob could take it. She would just have to wait 24 hours to spend it. So far, I've just been talking about protecting Bob from Alice cheating, but Alice will also need a similar set of logic to protect her. You can see that here, just with the names reversed. That way, if Bob posts a revoked transaction, Alice will be able to punish him too. There's just one more complication. As currently explained, the secrets can be used by the wrong person. This secret here is given to Alice to protect her from Bob cheating. It's supposed to give her Bob's $10K if he broadcasts a revoked transaction. But remember, she also has a copy of this transaction. As written, there's nothing stopping Alice from broadcasting the transaction herself and using the secret even though Bob didn't broadcast it. This whole punishment scheme turns out to be fairly tricky. While providing one protection, we opened up another opportunity to cheat. To handle this last piece, Alice and Bob actually maintain their own versions of the transactions, each only containing revocation logic that protects the other person. Note the bottom output on Alice's version is now just a simple payment out. She won't be able to take Bob's share through this logic because that logic is now contained in Bob's version only. If you're like me, this all won't entirely click until you walk through some real examples, which you can find on my longer deep dive video. But for now, just keep in mind that all this logic is providing a roundabout way to rip up or invalidate older transactions. Let's review the whole system briefly. To open a payment channel with Bob, Alice creates a funding transaction that requires both her and Bob's signatures to spend from. But before broadcasting it, she gets Bob to sign the first in a sequence of withdrawal transactions, this one covering her full $100K. And as we just learned, Alice and Bob both maintain their own versions of these. When Alice goes to buy a drink, she and Bob create a new transaction where Alice only gets $90K back and Bob now $10K. They each exchange revocation secrets to the previous state transactions and sign the latest version. Now if one of them posts a revoked transaction, the other one can claim the cheater's share. As long as no one cheats, Bob and Alice continue to exchange Bitcoin by signing new transactions and exchanging revocation keys. If they decide to close the channel, either one can sign and broadcast a latest transaction, withdrawing their balances from the payment channel. Now that we've covered the basics of an individual channel, let's move on to sending Bitcoin through multiple channels. This is where the Lightning protocol shines because it would be expensive to set up a new channel with every new person you wanted to send Bitcoin to. I mentioned in the intro that Alice can send money through Bob without worrying that Bob will run off with it through a special contract. Let's walk through that in more detail now. Alice deducts the amount she wants to send from her main output and puts it in a new one, and it's this output that forms that contract with Bob. This contract guarantees Bob $10K only if he can provide proof that he paid Carol. Once this contract is in place, Bob will first pay Carol, get a receipt proving he paid her, and then be able to claim the money locked in the contract from Alice. Bob is willing to go ahead and pay Carol first because the money is guaranteed to him by that contract. Technically, this is implemented with a hash of a secret, where the secret provides proof of payment. A hash is a function that only goes one way, so you can't go backwards from the output to the input, but it's easy to check once somebody tells you the input. Carol will initially pick a secret number, then generate its hash and tell it to Alice and Bob. This enables Alice to set up the contract with Bob. After he pays Carol, Carol sends him the secret P, allowing him to unlock the funds from Alice. But how can Bob be sure that Carol will give him the secret after he pays her? Bob sets up a similar contract with Carol, locking funds up unless she gives him that same secret. This way, Carol must reveal the secret in order to claim her funds, and this in turn allows Bob to claim his. Let's walk through an example of Alice paying Dave through Bob and Carol, supposing each has a $200K channel between them with a balance of $100K on each side. Dave first creates a secret and a hash of that secret. He shares it with Alice, typically through a QR code on a Lightning invoice. Alice then sets up a new output or contract with Bob, deducting some money from her main output. Bob then sets up a contract with Carol, doing the same deduction, and finally Carol sets up a similar contract with Dave. Once everyone has signed these new transactions and revoked earlier ones, Dave reveals the secret to Carol. At this point, if Dave disappeared, Carol could broadcast the transaction and still pull all of her money out of the payment channel she has with Dave. But the normal case is for Dave and Carol to stay connected and remove the temporary contract, moving the balance from that temporary output to Dave's main output. Then Carol passes the secret along to Bob, and they also create a new transaction that removes the temporary contract and moves the balance to Carol's main output. Finally, Alice and Bob create a new transaction similarly. So contracts were set up left to right, locking up money temporarily, and then funds were unlocked right to left to complete the payment through a second round of transactions. But what would happen if Dave never revealed the secret? Everybody's money would be stuck in these outputs that require a secret to unlock. To avoid this, a timeout is added to all the transactions, returning funds to the original owner if the secret isn't revealed by a deadline. Because these temporary outputs involve a time lock and hash, they're called hash time lock contracts, or HTLC outputs. Amazingly, there's no risk at any point from the route setup to the final completion. Everyone gets paid or no one does. Even in the middle, if Carol received the secret from Dave and didn't tell Bob, the only way she could claim the funds would be to broadcast the transaction containing the secret, which would then give it to Bob. A few other details. To incentivize people in the middle, everyone upstream pays a little more than the amount requested, leaving a small fee for the middle routing nodes. This is important because the middle nodes must lock up some of their capital during the transaction, which means they can't use it to earn routing fees for other payments. There's also a decrement in the timeout deadline from left to right to ensure everyone has enough time to cash out the secret before their partner upstream can cash out through the timeout. And finally, I mentioned how Lightning enhances privacy between people, and you might think that sending payments through many people would undo this. Amazingly, participants never know more than the hop before and after them. They wouldn't know if they were in a 3 or 10-person chain. Just like the Tor network, information is stored in an onion, where you can only decrypt the layer needed to get to the next hop, and every other layer remains encrypted. Okay, those are the main pieces of Lightning, a protocol that enables people to send Bitcoin without touching the main network, except for the initial payment channel setup, and as an insurance backstop if someone disappears or breaks the rules. The primary goal of Bitcoin is to provide decentralized money, but as usage grows, recording every transaction on every node could make node operation too expensive, thereby reducing decentralization. Lightning promises to offload this burden to hopefully keep nodes affordable and decentralized, all while enhancing speed, reducing cost, and improving privacy. But it does have some challenges. The larger the transaction, the harder it is to send via the Lightning Network. This is because every channel must have enough capacity to route a payment. Think of payment channels as fixed tubes with money that can slide between either end. A payment can't move through the tube if there isn't enough money already in the tube and if it's not on the right side. In fact, when you first open a channel, the entire balance will be on your side, which means no one can send you money until you first send some out. Furthermore, the channel balance, or how much is on each side, is actually kept private, which makes it hard to tell if a given route will work and how much it will cost. And speaking of cost, unlike with normal Bitcoin transactions, the fees scale with the amount you're sending, because operators must lock up more Bitcoin to run larger channels. So for larger amounts, it may be cheaper to stick with a regular Bitcoin transaction. Lightning also requires being online all the time. Payments require several interactions, so both the sender and receiver must be online to complete a transaction. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important to constantly monitor the blockchain for revoked transactions. Finally, backups are potentially more difficult on Lightning versus Bitcoin, where you can just write down 24 words and be done forever. On Lightning, at a minimum, you must make a backup every time you open a channel, and even then there's some risk of loss if your channel partner is uncooperative. Thankfully, developers are rapidly improving the protocol and building services to make Lightning more usable. Several wallets like Zebedee, Moon, Breeze, and Phoenix already hide a lot of the complexity of managing channels, so you can just send and receive Bitcoin cheaper and faster. Several are also non-custodial, which means funds are always under your control. As more people join the network and it becomes more interconnected, it will be easier to make payments. I encourage you to give Lightning a try. For me, it's fulfilling some of the initial promise of Bitcoin as a currency that can actually be used and not just invested in. I'd like to thank my sponsor, Zebedee, who makes great tools for integrating Bitcoin into games, and also got me excited about Bitcoin again by sending me my very first Lightning payment. If you'd like more detail, check out my Lightning transaction deep dive video, where I walk through the actual spec and scripts line by line. And if that's not enough, I highly recommend reading Mastering the Lightning Network, which should be coming out soon and is already partially available since it's open source. Finally, if you're feeling generous, you'll find a tip link I created with the Zebedee wallet in the description. With the magic of Lightning, you can send me even a single penny. Thanks.